Today we're going to be talking about the book of Ruth. And I made a smart comment about most people would have difficulty finding it. One, because it's very, very small. But it's on page 276, 277 in your Pew Bibles. And we're going to make several references to it today. It is one of the great, great short stories of all time. And the message is just so impactful. So I'm going to share with you today some information about three people who lived in about the 12th century BC. And in the next few minutes, we're going to see how their lives will intersect in ways that only God could have orchestrated. And even though we are removed by about over 3,000 years from Boaz, Naomi, and Ruth, I still want you to look at their lives in the context of the issues that we face today as a church and as individuals. And the time period is the time of the judges, and most of you are battle-worn already. We've been going through Joshua and Judges. As Lisa pointed out last week, the children of Israel were in a spin cycle where they would be with the Lord, and then they would sin, and then they would be oppressed by some kind of weird people, foreign people. And then they would cry out to God, and then God would deliver a judge or a military leader or a leader, and they would be delivered. And then they'd be good again. And then next week, they would be bad again. So that's the cycle in which we are introducing these three people. The first one is Boaz. He is single, middle-aged, maybe a little bit older than middle-aged. In fact, maybe a lot older than middle-aged, but he works out a lot. You know, he's really cut. He is a well-sandaled farmer who lives in Bethlehem in Judah. And from what we know about him, he has remained faithful through all of this muck and mess of Judges. He has remained faithful to the God of Abraham. And he knows and he follows the law of Moses. And he's earned in this little town of Bethlehem and the area around it, he has earned as being an honest and respectful man. He's a real leader in the community. And he respects the people who work on his farms. You can go into Ruth and you can see one example. When the harvesters come out, he will greet them. May the Lord be with you. And they respond to him. May the Lord bless you. So he knows the law, but even more than that, he also is known for leaving the gleanings. And the gleanings were the leftovers from the harvest. And that would provide for the poor, the widows, the aliens, the fatherless. So he was a good man. And yet there's another side to Boaz that's a little bit different. He came from a very interesting background. His mother was Rahab. And Rahab was a prostitute. Or if not, she certainly ran a brothel. And we're already familiar with her because she was in Jericho. And there were two Israelite spies who came to her house. And she hid them. And then she lied to the authorities in order to cut a deal for her family to get out of Jericho before the walls came down. All of us have little nicks and scratches in our genealogy, and so I think Boaz is no different than anyone else. So overall, he seems like a pretty upstanding guy. Now we have Naomi. She's married, has two sons. She's living in Bethlehem. A famine has forced this Israelite family to leave that area and go east across the Jordan River into the land of the Moabites. And we know quite a bit about them. These were these pagan folks who worship all kinds of gods, and they had all this immoral impurity going on in their lives. They were a bad group, and God warned us about them. Her husband dies almost as soon as they get into Moab. She has two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who marry Moabite women, which is not a good thing to do, but they marry Moabite women. And within 10 years, they've had no children, and then both of them die. So Naomi goes from having a husband, two sons, land, and a future in Bethlehem to absolutely nothing and living in Moab. Later, we'll find out that when Naomi goes back to Bethlehem, she will join the ranks of the lowest social class among the Israelite society. That is the poor and the widows. And it appears, as we learn about her, that she's compounded her problem because she brings one of her Moabite daughters-in-law back with her. She loves this person, but she is so overcome with grief that she just wants to go back. Now let's look at what it says in Ruth. It talks about Naomi in chapter 1. She gets back and she says, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. All of us sometimes go through things in our life where we feel that we've been filled with tragedy, calamity, and we just want to yell at God, why? What's going on? Where are you? And so far, that's what we see in Naomi's life. She seems to be a good person, but she is so overcome with grief. Now, the third person, Ruth. Perhaps the most interesting of the three. She is not from Bethlehem. In fact, she is a Moabite. So she has one strike against her already, if you're looking at it from the Israelite point of view. And her DNA is kind of fuzzy as well. She is descended from Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. And if you recall, Lot had incestuous relations with both of his daughters. And the result was a son named Moab. Now, the hits just keep on coming with Ruth. We discover that she marries into an Israelite family. And in several years of marriage, there have been no children, and then her Israelite husband dies. Now, Ruth, who is a widow now, is stunned when her mother-in-law says that I'm going back home to Bethlehem, and I think you should stay here. Listen to what Ruth says. And this is our passage today. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God." Holy Moab. We did not see this coming from a Moabite woman. Somehow the God of Abraham has worked through her life. Now, let's go to Bethlehem and see how this all works out. All three of these individuals are in Bethlehem. It is the springtime, it's harvest, April, May. And they would harvest the barley first and then the wheat. And then we'll see their lives begin to intersect, and we'll see the power of God work through all three of these people. So let's begin with Naomi this time. The book of Ruth is written from her perspective. Everything that goes on in that book is related to her, one way or the other. Her husband dies, her sons die, the Moabite daughters-in-law coming back to Bethlehem. She finds a relative named Boaz who is a kinsman redeemer. So her life is tied to it all. And also, never forget when Naomi makes this selfless attempt to help Ruth. Now, I know it involves some threshing floor shenanigans between Boaz and Ruth, but the end result is that the name of her son, Mahlon, who is dead, and that is Ruth's deceased husband, his name will carry on. Now, let's look at Ruth and see what's happened to her then. Ruth is a person who is able to look through Naomi's pain. Naomi is really crushed, and she's able to look through it. And it was Ruth who was the foreigner, the stranger in a foreign land, She is the one who becomes a gleaner. So she had every right to feel hopeless, but she is never, never helpless. God truly worked through this Moabite woman. And now we have Boaz. He knew what it was like to be an outsider. He's a successful farmer now, but his history goes back to Rahab. And when he sees Ruth in the fields gleaning, he takes pity upon her and he protects her. And it was Boaz who redeemed his kinsman's inheritance and married his widow, Ruth. All right? Excuse me, I am dry as a bone here. So Boaz and Ruth have a child, and that child's name is Obed. Naomi, once bitter and empty, now has a place, an heir for her deceased son. And that's why the Jewish readers of ages ago would understand what we read in Ruth chapter 4. Near the end, when it says, and in verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's confusing sometimes whose baby is that, but it's very important, and the Jewish people would understand it. The book of Ruth is about obedience, it's about redemption, it's about responsibility, it's about doing the right things the right way. It's about audacious faith. All three of these people were used by God to further his cause. And it sounds a great deal to me like Canyon Hills. Because we are a church of faithful, obedient people who do the best we can. And we serve this church in the name of Jesus Christ. Finally, the Jewish people reading the book of Ruth, they would be very concerned about the little genealogy that appears at the end. I've already read it. And this, again, is in chapter 4. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It was important for them. That was the genealogy of that era. David, of course, was the great King David. He was the one that would unite. He was the one who would get rid of a lot of the muck and mess that the judges were dealing with. Not that David was a saint, but he's on our side. And that's what they're concerned about. Now, the ultimate kinsman redeemer in our life is Jesus Christ. Yeah. What kind of genealogy chart would Jesus have? And I think it's important for us, and if you have your Bibles, look at Matthew chapter 1. And this is I've made this comment before, but I think the first time I read the Bible, or someone said, you need to read the Gospel. So start with Matthew chapter 1. And of course, the first thing you run into is a genealogy chart. Begat, begat, begat. And it just doesn't work. But this genealogy chart, and it's not complete, but this is the genealogy chart of Jesus Christ. And look what's happening here, what Jesus is doing through Matthew. He includes some people we know. He includes 3 women and another one who is footnoted, and then one, of course, we celebrate Mary, the mother of Jesus, but we'll put her aside. Let's start with verse 3, Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. This is the genealogy of Jesus. These are the people Jesus wants us to know about that are in his lineage. Verse 3, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, Tamar was a Canaanite. She was an outsider. And she used to like to play dress up. And once she dressed up like a harlot. And she ended up having twin boys by her father-in-law. I'll let you figure that story out on your own. But an interesting person. So there's one. Why would that person be in that genealogy? Let's keep going. Let's go down to verse 5. Solomon, the father of Boaz, we know Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. We know this person. We just read about her. What was her occupation? Prostitute. What was her spiritual gift? I suppose lying, because she lied to the authorities to make that deal. But also, she put a crimson rope in the window of her home at Jericho, which really was a Gentile version of the Passover. But she's in the genealogy of Jesus. And let's go down to the third one. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. What was Ruth's occupation? She was a gleaner. She picked up what was left from the harvest. That's what the poor people did. That's what the widows did. And of course, her background, she was an outcast. She was a Moabite. And yet what you'll see in the book of Ruth, what a beautiful, devoted, selfless person that Ruth was. Now, there's one more, and we'll do it right now. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. They don't mention her by name, but that's Bathsheba. Bathsheba, the one who needed to get some better window blinds for her bathroom. But the point is, Jesus feels it's important to put these women in his genealogy, because these are the kinds of people that he dealt with in his ministry. These women did not lead a perfect life. And in many respects, they were trying to make life better for themselves, sometimes through trickery. But the point is, we will be blessed by the fact that these women are in that genealogy of Jesus. There's a little book that's written by Carolyn James, long title, but the first part of it is called The Gospel of Ruth. And in that book, she talks about that the book of Ruth views God through the eyes of a woman. God through the eyes of a woman. So the lineage of Jesus can be traced back to a baby in the lap of Naomi, an old woman who had lost everything, who was bitter, and then who became full once again. As you read the book of Ruth, as you read it this week, I hope, it is so filled with so much goodness and devotion. You need to read it again and again. In fact, I really encourage people to read it at different stages in your life, because it'll have a different meaning for you. 4 verses that mean so much to us. So we're going to stand and we're going to share in our affirmation of faith. And as you listen to that affirmation of faith, think about Ruth. Let's stand.